Good morning. Welcome to Genre Chat Podcast for SeriousWriter.com. I'm Caleb Walton, and today I'm excited to welcome my friend Annette Whipple to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm really glad to be here and be sharing some of my experiences with your viewers.
I'm glad to have you on the show. I'm always excited when I can interview someone that writes for children. It's such an exciting genre, and kids' books had such an impact on my life. I remember sitting with my parents at night and, reading stories, nonfiction and fiction stories before bedtime, and it just gave me a real love for learning and for reading, and it's such an important genre. How did you get started writing for children?
Well, I started blogging. That's how I started writing. I was sharing my daughter's kind of journey with a speech disorder. And as I was blogging, I wanted to improve my writing, so I took some more classes. And then I was reading a book with my children. It was called, I think it was called Roar, the Christian Family's Guide to Narnia. It was a companion guide to the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And my kids loved it. They wanted to know more about what was happening in the stories. And this book gave that information to them, gave them some background information, some additional information, and they just loved it. And I was like, I could write this kind of a book. And I had that idea before too, that I could write this kind of book when I was reading some children's nonfiction books. But I never had the thought of, I have an idea for a specific book and I could be that person to write it. And so I was thinking about, what other books, popular book series could I write a companion guide for? And that was in 2014 when I had the idea. And next year, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion, a chapter-by-chapter guide, will be out with Chicago Review Press. So it was many years of work and labor, and I'm really excited for it. So that was kind of what got me started. But I spent a lot of time studying the publishing world and really working on my writing for children, because before I'd only written for adults, so I needed to learn about writing for children a little bit more. And so in 2015, I went to a writing conference that was specifically for children's nonfiction writers. I loved it. It was a blast. And I learned a lot, met some great people, some great friends and since then I've been watching their publishing journey, and they've been watching mine too, it's just exciting. And that was where I was introduced to the educational market, which is I think it's like the publishing world's best kept secret, because it's a great way to break into writing for children.
And I've heard that before, that's a good subgenre that a lot of people overlook when they're looking at how to break into children's writing. What exactly is the educational market? What defines the educational market? I know you reference schools and library books, things like that for kids.
Exactly. So when you think of books that children read, we have trade books, which are available in bookstores. They're the ones that are more of the popular books. But then we have the educational market books, which are designed by publishers for the school and library market. So they come up with ideas that are going to match curriculum, and then they hire writers to write they hire writers to write their ideas for a specific age. And I have a couple of my books here. My first book was Insects as Producers. I didn't get to choose the title, but it matches all the other titles in the series: Insects as a Food Source, Insects as Decomposers, Insects as Healers, and so on. And so this book was written for 4th through 6th graders, so longer sentences, higher vocabulary, and a very specific topic. But so I also wrote this book, Flowers, and another book in this series was called Soil, but it wasn't just about soil. It was about how soil supports plants, because this is a plant series. A Closer Look at Plants is the name of the whole series. And kids
love those types of books, especially if it has something to do with what they're learning or a little niche that they're passionate about. That can be such an inspiration for kids. Yes.
And when I was writing this, when they asked do you want to write, the initial question was, do you want to write a book about plants? And sure. And it was 2 books. And I said, sure. And then I got the actual assignment, and it was flowers. and soil. I'm like, ooh, soil, how am I going to make that interesting? But I was so excited because I found out that soil is really interesting. Like there are hundreds of colors of soil. It's not just brown. And it's not, and soil and dirt are different. It just excites me to learn these new things and be able to share that with children. And then I also wrote two more books. One is Africa, one is North America. And so those other books I spoke about, they have a very specific, very, very tight topic, where I had to write about Africa in 1,200 words. I used, so these books are also highly visual. And I used those images, both photographs and diagrams, to my advantage with, adding more information with captions, because there's so much that you can include. So
when you have such a broad topic like that, I mean, when you have a very specific, like, insects as producers, that's a very tight topic. But when you have such a broad thing like an entire continent, how do you narrow down what to include and what not to include?
Well, it began with lots of research, and they did, my editor did want me to kind of focus on culture and people. So that was a slight focus. It's not really though. And so I spent a lot of time researching, and eventually I just had to say, okay, I know I have more than enough information and more than enough research. And now what's the most important part, what's going to be important for the children to understand, as well as what's going to interest them. So, and I highly recommend the educational market for people who are curious and they enjoy learning and then sharing that information with others. A lot of people have their own writing ideas and they don't want to take the time to do something like an assignment, but for someone like me, it's perfect. And the one benefit, well, there's actually a bunch of benefits for the educational market. And I actually wrote some down. So first-time writers are welcome. No agent is needed. And you don't need teaching experience, even though if you were a teacher or are a teacher, it's to your benefit, and definitely include that on your resume. But you don't actually need to have that experience. Something that is important to understand is, though, it's work for hire. So the publisher will almost always own the copyright. So those words that I wrote no longer belong to me. Even though my name is on the cover, the publisher owns those words now, that text. Did you have a question?
Well, I was wondering on that, you may be about to address this, but when you go into like copywriting and work for hire things, how does the pay scale work with it? Because I've heard a lot of how there's some that does work off of royalties, but then a lot of times when it is like school and library books, a lot of times it works slightly differently. It's like you get paid up front.
Yes. So for these books and for most work for hire publishers, educational publishers, you're told up front, how many words and anything else that you'll need to include. So I had to write an activity, a recipe. Now, for this publisher, I did have to do the index and the glossary. That's not always needed, though. And then I also did show what you know questions and further reading. So it was actually more than 1,200 words with all that additional information in there. But I was also told when my deadline would be, and I was told how much I would make. Now, for two of the books that I wrote, the word count changed midstream before the manuscripts were due, but after I'd put it in, one of them was completely drafted and ready for some good revisions. But you're told up front how much money you can earn from a project. And depending on the publisher, and there's another term called packager. A packager is like a middleman. A packager will put together a book series. They'll hire the author, they'll have someone design the book, and then they send it to the publisher to have it printed. A packager, because they're the middleman, they don't pay as much, but it can be a good way to to get started with the work with the educational market. Now, for other projects, the pay can be decent because you know that you're selling it, and it's not going to be one of the educational market books aren't going to have the same sort of, and the pay won't be the same as an advance for a picture book with the trade market. But if it's a 1,200 word book and compare that to the research that you would do and the writing you would do for a 1,200 word article, it might be comparable. So, and it's a great way for a lot of writers to kind of maintain a steady income or to get started with writing for children.
Now, with writing for, and you mentioned this earlier, I know there's a lot. Your age, what age you're writing for, has a lot to do with like sentence structure, how much complexity you can incorporate in there. Is there a kind of guide or something that nonfiction writers can use? Because I'm guessing even just this few years between third grade and sixth grade, there's a whole different reading level that you have to write for. How do you make sure that you stay in the right category?
Well, kind of understanding what age group you're writing for and seeing examples of those books can help. Because if you're writing for a if you're writing for kindergartners, you might have 1 or 3 words on a page, but for first graders, you might have a few sentences, but maybe each sentence starts on a different line instead of being a full paragraph. When it comes to vocabulary, there's actually a great resource that I can't think of the name of the book. It's something like the Word Book.
I've heard of that.
The Writer's Word Book. So that's one resource. And another resource would be the ATOS or ATOS analyzer. And I actually, on my website, AnnetteWhipple.com, I actually have tips for children's writers and another resource called Resources for Children's Writers. And I have all sorts of information about like those kinds of things because it's so specific to writing for children. And but I think it's called Renaissance Learning is who does the ATOS analyzer. And basically you copy and paste your text into this little box and submit it. And within a minute or so, it's going to tell you your word count, which you should already know. It's going to tell you how many words, your average word length, your average sentence length, because all of that matters. And then it will also tell you what the ATOS level is. So it's
interesting.
So
it helps you stay sort of on track with where you need to be.
Yes, because even though, so a publisher might say, the continence books were for grades 3 to 5. And so I try to kind of hit that middle mark, but if I don't, it's okay. But so another publisher might say, I need you to write this at the 2nd grade, 4th month. And it might be very specific. So like one extra 3-syllable word might throw that way off. So, there is a bit of a science to it, but it's a fun challenge, I think.
That's a challenging element that I think a lot of people that don't write for children sort of take for granted, because if you're writing for, even young adults or adults, you really don't have to worry about, your own style may be a little more literary or a little bit more conversational, but you really don't have to worry about what your audience's reading level is. You just kind of assume that everybody's on the same level. But with writing for children, that's a whole other skill set that you have to need to be very precise in your language.
Yes, and picture books are very different than the educational market books, because a picture book is meant to be read out loud by an adult. So it can have higher vocabulary. It can have longer sentences. It's a totally different genre, really.
Because you're right, most of the time the children are not going to be reading the books themselves. So you can have a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to language.
Yes.
Now, a picture book, you're talking about like a lot of visual elements, and then like something like that.
This is Terrific Tongues by Maria Gianferrari, and it's just a fun book. And some people think that nonfiction books are dry and boring, but they really don't have to be. Even the educational books, the publishers don't want authors to be writing like an encyclopedia. They do not want that, because children can use the internet for that. And so that's kind of changed how nonfiction books are now. But so this book says, if you had a tongue like a straw, you might be a moth. And then it gives additional text here with information about that moth. But the illustrations will often tell the rest of the story. And with picture books, you always have to leave room for illustrations. Otherwise, it's a short story. And that's what a lot of beginning writers make the mistake of. You know, you might have a great story, but it's not a picture book. And that's a huge difference. So the illustrations need to tell some details.
Exactly. And that's a lot of things. When you do think of nonfiction, a lot of times you think biographies, instruction books, like self-help, step-by-step improvement books. But with kids, it can be fun, and because those things are all based on fact. Even though you can use illustrations and artwork and even rhymes and stuff like that to help kids remember this stuff, that's still considered nonfiction because it's not an actual a fictional story that you made up.
Right. And I have an offer for a book that is a nature topic, and it's kind of a question and answer format. And so it's pretty expository, just very traditional nonfiction writing. But then there's an element on each page spread where an animal talks directly to the reader. And it's kind of sassy, but animals don't talk. They just don't. And so that's kind of changed that book from being nonfiction to being more of an informational book. And it's just as soon as you add any element that is not true, it's no longer nonfiction. You can have a highly researched picture book, middle grade book, YA book. It can be highly researched, but as soon as those fictional elements are added, it's no longer nonfiction.
Interesting. I find that very interesting to go with exactly how far away can you stray from the bare fact before it becomes fiction. And there's a lot of debate about that, about what qualifies as fiction or nonfiction, or inspired by a true story instead of based on a true story. Because there's so many different levels, shades that you can go with that.
Yes, and I don't think I would want to be the librarian having to shelve all of the books that are being published these days, because there could just be that one little thing in there that's like, oh wait, did that really happen though? And they didn't do the research, so they might not know if that was a fictional element or not. So yeah.
Exactly. How do you go about your research? I mean, a lot of these topics, like the Africa and the different insect books, how do you go about your research and make sure that everything's accurate?
So when it comes to researching, I tend to start with the internet. Not that, and it's just going to kind of give me a base. Now, there are going to be some great websites out there for research, and then there's certainly things to avoid as well. But the internet can give me a good idea of what I'm kind of getting into. And then from there, I like to use books. I consult with experts, and I try to get hands-on as well. When I was writing the Insects as Producers book, I met with a beekeeper, she had read the text of my book, and she was only an expert on one portion of it. But I also people at university professors often are very passionate about what they teach about and want others to share that. And so they're often happy to give an expert review on a short piece of work. Now, they might not want to read 40,000 words, but 500 words, okay. 1,000 words, okay. So I actually have a manuscript out to an expert right now, and it's something that I get excited about. But I'm also, so when I was, for my Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion book that's coming out next year, my editor and I together agreed that I didn't need to go to each of the home sites for the research, but I did go to the Almanza Wilder Farm in upstate New York. And I got to talk to an expert there. I got to walk on the floorboards that Almanza walked when he was a boy. Almanzo is the main character in the Little House book called Farmer Boy.
Mm-hmm.
And Laura Ingalls Wilder does not show her face in that book at all. But she was telling the story of her husband's boyhood. So I went to that home because that's the one that's closest to me. Still 8 hours away, but I got to really be hands-on with that, with the farm, with the house, and it was an incredible experience. And anytime you can get hands-on. So if I was writing a book about monkeys, I would find a monkey expert and I would see if I could meet them. And when we're getting hands-on, it gives us a chance to ask questions that we might not have thought of during our regular research. And so, this week I'm actually consulting with an expert on an animal about a different project. So, and it's just exciting. It adds a lot of value to the research that goes way beyond books. But books are my friend when I research as well. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk just a minute about your writing process. Where do you usually start? I know outlining is very important in nonfiction, which to me seems like it would be the hardest thing in the world because I don't outline for my fiction novels. It's having to outline very precisely. I know with it, since they're a lot more structured than fiction can be, you sort of need that outline to go along.
It can be much more structured. Sometimes it's not, but it can be. So I've tried a few different ways of kind of getting my thoughts together. Sticky notes are my friend. And sometimes, I'll look at my research and I'll look at all of my notes and I'll just start writing down some of those major topics that I want to include on a sticky note. And then after I've done that with a bunch of those topics that I do want to include, I see that there's some overlap. It's like, oh, okay. So those are really going to be answered together. Or maybe one of those is just maybe that's too much focus on the eyes of a snake. It could be, how much information do you really need to add there? And that's when you kind of have to rein in the research and just start writing. But so I do outline. For the educational publishers, they will often request an outline before you get started. And when you are working with a traditional publisher, anytime you write nonfiction, except for a picture book, like middle grade YA or adult nonfiction, you don't pitch the entire book. You don't write I shouldn't say that. You don't write the entire book first. You write a sample, maybe 3 chapters or so, as well as a proposal for the book detailing, outlining what the book will look like. And because of that, so with my Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion book, I had some elements in the book that I was really excited to include. And they're like, it's just going to be too long. And so my newsletter subscribers will get these little trivia quizzes for each of the books because I couldn't offer it. It can't be in the book, but I thought it was a fun idea. My kids had loved it with the Narnia books. And so it's like, that's just something else to do. Let's do some trivia. And so now I just offer it to my newsletter subscribers because it just couldn't fit in to the book. And there were some other changes as well that the editor and the whole publishing team suggested that we make, and I was fine with those changes, and it's going to be a better book because of that editorial process. So I'm happy with it. So
now on the books, like companion books, I know you said you were inspired by the companions to the Narnia books. What is that book like? What does a companion to a classic like Narnia or Little House on the Prairie series? What does that look like?
So for my book, there's so much history in the Little House books, and so much of that history is too far from children today that they don't quite understand it. Now, I think if a child lives on a farm or does a lot of, or maybe even a farming community, I think they will understand those books a lot better than a city dweller. And because of some of the information is kind of related to the historical living, but I also have a lot of information that's just history and context and why they did that. And in my book, I'm addressing the racism that's in the Little House books because it needs to be addressed. And so, and some will say it was history, and it was, but it's hard for an 8 or 9-year-old to really wrap their head around that. So I talk about that in my book and try to help them to understand this side and this side and why things were happening in that way. So
it's very difficult for us to look at events in history when we have it from our perspective now. And it changes everything. It doesn't necessarily justify things that are still wrong, but it does help you to understand why people did the things they did when you look at the whole picture of the environment they were in, whereas we just look at it removed from where we are now and what we've learned as a culture now. And it especially as a kid, that can be very confusing.
And I feel like I think some teachers have gotten away from using the Little House books in class because of some of those hard topics, and you don't want to skip over them as part of the book.
Exactly.
And so I try to help. Now, my book is for the child, but it would also help the adult reading with a child to have that discussion.
Know how to address those topics, because all of that is very important. It's important for kids to be able to process complex social situations like that, and something like that's very helpful, whereas a lot of people wouldn't think. I mean, when I read the books and when I watched some of the TV programs, it was there and it sparked a lot of conversation with the family, but there was no actual direct digging into the culture,
right?
Which I felt like would have helped even more to start more productive conversation.
Right. So my companion guide is addressing some of that histories of the culture. I have a lot of sidebars called fact or fiction. So when it comes to, in one of the books it said Mother Wilder's dress was wider than the doorway. Is that accurate? Actually, it was. And so I addressed that. When I was a child reading The Long Winter, I thought, it was probably a bad winter. But I thought that Laura Ingalls Wilder exaggerated the brutality of the winter. And in my research, I found out that she did not exaggerate it. And in some ways, the winter may have been even more difficult. And I include some information about that. But in addition to the culture and the history context, my book has 75 activities, which, crafts, things to do, activities, as well as recipes. And, some are a little more detailed than others. Some are like, oh yeah, you can do this without any equipment, any, special props or anything. So I try to have a good level of that. And there's already the Little House cookbook out there, and it's a great cookbook, but it is an authentic cookbook in the sense of these recipes are from the 1800s, and the directions are really written for an experienced cook. So the recipes that I include, I tried to make them very kid-friendly. Not all of them are super kid-friendly, but for somebody who's curious about what it was like, it'll be a good one for the kids. And try to use more pantry staples instead of we don't have. I personally don't have lard in my pantry. Maybe you do, Caleb, but I don't. So try to make it a little more modern.
We're in the South. Everybody's got lard in their pantry.
So the history context, the 75 activities, I defined about 500 words that are pioneer terms. And let me tell you, that was probably my least favorite part of writing the companion guide, because a lot of the words, I had a good idea of what it was, but I needed to make sure it was accurate. And yet I can't just copy the definition from a dictionary. So that was probably one of the more challenging parts, because it was time consuming and it just wasn't fun. The research was fun. Writing about the other things was fun, but the writing definitions, it's just not my favorite thing to do. But I wanted to include it because I think it's going to be helpful to readers. And so, there will also be a lot of historical images in the Laura Ingalls Wilder Companion. And many times, when it comes to photographs in a book, the author does not put those in. They might make suggestions, but they don't actually say this is the one that is going to go in. Sometimes they just give research, do a little bit of research to say an image like this would be great. But for this publisher, they required me to do the photo research, and so there's a handful of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family and the Wilder family photos, but there's also images from that are kind of speak to the broader history as well. But if I remember right, there are maybe about 50 images that will be in the book. And that's in addition to the drawings that for the activities that will be separate. I had to take photos of all of the activities, not all. Any activity that kind of needed a photo for directions, I needed to take photos, and an illustrator is making line drawings to help a reader know how to do those activities better. So it wasn't just writing that I was doing for this book. There was a lot of other research and
a lot of hands-on stuff for a companion. And this goes back to something you mentioned earlier. Does the Little House books, do they count as nonfiction?
No.
Strictly nonfiction? Or because I'm guessing that it's hard to say because it is technically biography, but
she based the books on her life and on, and included people that were in her life.
Mm-hmm.
However, she changed the names of some characters. And I'm calling them characters. They were people in real life, but in the books, they become characters because it is fiction. Laura Ingalls Wilder knew how to write a good story, and so she sometimes changed things to make it a better story. And even dialogue, there's lots of dialogue within the books.
And of course, that can't be word for word when you're thinking that she was an adult when she wrote the books, remembering things that happened when she was a kid. So it's based on her actual experience, but it is still counted as fiction.
Yes. And she actually did, for the time period, I'll say, she did try to make sure things were accurate. There was an American Indian chief. She wanted to name him in her books, and she wrote to several places, several organizations to try to find out who this was. But because she was writing she thought she was off on the location. She was off by a state or two, and so she didn't actually find out the actual person's name, and so she used a different Indian chief's name basically within the book. So but she did try to research. When she actually had written to family members and asked them to send her letters of stories from her childhood. And so she did try to keep things accurate. But when you're 60-some years old and you're writing about when you were a young child, there might not be so many. And
also at that point, it's easy for us to do a simple Google search and figure out somebody's name, whereas then you had to do a lot of digging and still may not find the accurate answers just because now information is so readily available.
That's right. And but I do appreciate that she attempted, and Laura Ingalls Wilder did say that all that I wrote was true. It just wasn't the whole truth, and that's a paraphrase of her quote. I'm not exactly I don't remember the actual quote, but but she did change things. She really did. She excluded, she never included her brother in the books because he died when he was a baby. Yes, she had a young brother, and he died when he was a few months old. And so she left that out. She left out, they had lived in Burr Oak, Iowa. She didn't include that time period at all in her books. It was not a happy time. You've seen the TV show, you've read the books. I'm sure you remember Nellie. Well, Nellie was actually a composite character made, and instead of having like a mean girl, 3 different mean girls in the books, she brought back the character of Nellie, who was made up of 3 different girls. So it's
and I wonder, especially with the television show, how much of that. I read my parents read some of the books with me, but I'm guessing a lot of that is just going off creatively from exactly what was in the book. I haven't read all of them, so I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing a lot of that was not something that actually happened to her. It's just taking the characters and the setting and kind of running with it in certain situations.
And they ran with it. I think the show ran for 9 seasons, and they went pretty wildly off course. But they did try to keep to the kind of the wholesome family independent theme. Now the pilot for the Little House on the Prairie TV show, the pilot, I think it was an hour long. It might have been 2 hours long. It might have been more of a movie. But that was pretty close to the books.
Mm-hmm. Sort of like, I remember there was a miniseries that came out. I can't even remember. I think it was ABC or something. And I remember we watched it every time it came on as kids. We all watched it as a family because it went over like 2 or 3 months. It was long, had 7 or 8 episodes, but it was going over her life. And I always wondered how much of that was strictly from the books, because that seemed to be based a little bit more accurately in their time when they actually first went out on the frontier.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not familiar with that. But even some books, not just children's books, but even some biographies that have been written about Laura Ingalls Wilder have inaccuracies in them. And I remember I was reading one that was published fairly recently. I was like, oh, nope, that's not right there. But I think so much more newer research has come out in the past, I don't know how many years. I can't even guess how many years the recent research has been. I don't know if it'll be like 5 or 10, but it's really, researching now is a little easier than it was then. And I fear that some of those early biographies relied too much on her actual books, the little house books.
Than it did on her actual life.
Yes. So, and she, now a couple years ago, I think it was in 2015, but I might be mistaken, the book that Laura Ingalls Wilder had first that she had written and wanted published, she called it Pioneer Girl, and it was her autobiography. And that was actually published a couple years ago, long after she died. But the little house books were written after that didn't get published. It was, there was a long process, but basically someone eventually suggested that she write for children instead of adults. And it was wildly successful. So, yeah.
Interesting. That just goes to show, don't give up on your first rejection.
Yes, you never know.
She's one of the most famous American authors now.
Yep. And even
incredible.
The Pioneer Girl autobiography, it's annotated by Pamela Smith Hill, or Pamela Hill Smith. I can switch that around too easily. But the annotations are incredible. It's like a Laura Ingalls Wilder encyclopedia, and it's just an amazing resource for fans or people who just want to know more and want to know what really happened here. So, and who was this person? And so it's I find it to be very interesting, but obviously I'm a bit of a fan. So,
which makes you perfect for the job, honestly, because you're going to go the extra mile to make sure you know all the information.
Yeah, and there are people who have been researching Laura Ingalls Wilder for their lifetime, basically, 20, 30 years. I've been reading her books. I've been reading her biographies for more than 5 years, but really it's only been for 5 years or so that I've been really researching. And so I consulted with several Laura Ingalls Wilder experts, because I knew that something might not be quite right because of that, how I said the research wasn't, some of the books that were published weren't always accurate. So I had to make sure I did my own consultations as well.
That's good. I've really enjoyed having you on the show. I always love talking to children's writers. It's always so much fun. Do you have a website or anywhere people can go for more information?
Yes. My website's AnnetteWhipple.com. And I do have resources there for writers, especially for children's writers. And especially when it comes to for the children's educational market, because I feel like that's just a resource that something that we need to tap into, because we need writers for it. So, and nonfiction is hot, whether it's for the trade market or the educational market. There's a need for children's writers. So, yeah.
A lot of people, I think, take for granted how challenging it is to write for children, just because a lot of times it's very simple for adults to read, but you don't realize all of the work that goes into making it good for children.
Yes. To make it you can tell a good story, but is it going to be the right story? And for
Kids have
nonfiction,
such short attention spans, especially if it's not a story with like goofy characters, and especially if it's actual supposed to be teaching them things.
when it comes to nonfiction structure, and like, a lot of us will take an idea and, okay, so this is one format, but what else could I do with it? What else, could it be rhyming? And I actually don't write rhyming, but you could try these other, try question and answer, try layers of text. There's so many other things that you can do instead of just straightforward explanatory nonfiction. Maybe it would be better with just lots of visuals with, here's a picture, here's an image, and here's a blurb of text, making it a browsable nonfiction book. So there's lots of things to think about when it comes to writing for children. But I agree. People think that it's a little bit easier, and everybody wants to write a children's book. And good luck with that if you haven't actually studied the industry, read a ton of picture books, if that's what you want to write. Just like any genre, you need to be reading what you want to write. And I think it's especially true for writing for children, because it is a little different than the rest of the world. So
absolutely. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had so much fun talking with you.
Yes.
All right. And thank you guys for watching Genre Chat. We will see you next week.
Okay, thank you.